Hello. Thanks very much for everyone for staying here. We are showing this on Facebook, and it looks like we have more people on Facebook than here, but doesn't matter. I'm waiting for the speaker to rejoin us. So if you have a very short break, I'll make sure he's available.
The Comrade Mike has actually joined, I think.
Sorry, I can't see the list of participants. Hi. Okay. So can we have the first set of questions, comments? If comrades raise their hands, I will take, for those who are on Facebook, I will take comments if you want to write them. I can't get the audio connected to Facebook, but I will take the questions and translate them. You can also ask your question in Farsi, preferably in text, so we can translate it before showing it. No? Okay, Torab, I'll let you speak. Go ahead.
Thank you, Yasaman, and thank you, Comrade Mike, for an excellent review of a very complex and a long historical period in such a skillful, half an hour or so. I really enjoyed, especially your analysis showing the inherent nature of expansionism and militarism by capital even before industrial capital came on the scene, even during mercantilist period, even during the period which is called sort of primitive accumulation, 15th to 17th century in Europe. You have this expansionism and militarism in even merchant capital. As Marx says, even primitive accumulation is written in letters of blood and fire. You excellently explained all this in this example of British history in Iran. Thank you very much. It's very important against all these nonsensical analysis of imperialism, which we have inherited, unfortunately, from, second and third international, which persists to today and is causing so much confusion in terms of, is this imperialist? Do we have imperialism? Has imperialism gone? Has it changed? Are we seeing the decline of nation state? All this nonsense that is, so common these days in academic and unfortunately some political circles. You put an end to it, I think, with this even short introduction. And I really encourage comrades who haven't read your articles in Workers' Press about this history to refer to it and, consider it. Anyway, thank you very much. I have few questions. I raised one of them. I think it's quite interesting for us Iranians. As you may know, this relates to the relationship between the Islamic clergy and British imperialism, which goes back to the history of Indian colonization by the British, actually. I wonder if you could sort of shed some light on this. In a way, we could say that the British were the inventors of Islamic fundamentalism. When they started colonizing India, they were faced with at least 4 or 5 Sunni Muslim sects or 2 or 3 Shia sects in India. And when they took over an area, obviously they had to rule that area. And they had to rule that area based on the customs of the local population and the local rule class. So they had to turn to Islamic law in order to rule some of the parts which they had colonized. But who can you rely when there are so many different sects and so many different interpretations? So what the British did, went back to the Mughal Empire's tactic in this, which was to rewrite the text, the fundamental text of Islam, and then say, okay, this is Islam. There is nothing else but this version that we are giving you is the real Islam, based on fundamental text. So they started accumulating these texts. What the British did, took over this work and said, yes, we have to have an Islamic law which is based on a strict adherence to the text of Quran, the Hadith, the stories about what Prophet Muhammad did here, what Prophet Muhammad did there, the examples, the historical examples, and some of the fundamental texts in order to enforce Sharia law. So this fundamentalist approach based on a strict adherence to religious texts was actually an invention of the British. And they started actually building this, reading all these Mughal books, late 17th century, early 18th century. They had already devised the whole, contextual, framework for applying Sharia law in these areas that they control. Later on, they even set up schools in India, madrasas in India, to teach this new fundamentalist Islamic approach. And not only to develop this approach, but actually start exporting clergy to the whole area of the Middle East. They realized the role of these clergy in controlling local population. So they started training them in Delhi and exporting them to various places, including Iran. So one of the roots of actually Islamic fundamentalism is this 17th, 18th century British rule in India. And the fact that, there is a saying in Persia that if you lift the turban of any mullah, underneath it is written "Made in England." This is really, exactly, a reflection of this history. And we have had, for example, one of the first Islamic fundamentalist group in modern times that we had, Fedayins of Islam, the devotees of Islam, Nawab Safavi, who set up a terrorist group which actually assassinated 2 prime ministers in Iran and assassinated intellectuals like Kasravi, who was anti-mullahs, who was a scholar about on language and also on the Iranian constitutional revolution. In fact, this group is now well proven historically that they were initially totally associated by the British imperialism and carried out their plans, assassinated people, that they were told to assassinate. So this is one aspect. Another very curious aspect of this is the fact that then later on, say 1840s, 1850s, in these madrasas in India, there develops this tendency, which is based on the same fundamentalist, teaching that they have been trained by the British over the last 50 years or so, and they turn it against the English, saying in order to safeguard Islamic values against these foreigners, against these Christians, against these invaders, we have to stick to Islamic fundamentalism. So the Islamic fundamentalism, which was given to them by the British, is now used as a tool to mobilize people against the British. And this duality that we have in Islamic fundamentalism, even until today, they are on the one hand tools of imperialism. Just look at ISIS, for example. Who is left to deny that this is simply a tool in the hand of imperialism? It has been a tool in the hand of imperialism in the Middle East, despite the fact that it claims, anti-imperialism at the same time. So I wondered if, you could shed some light on this aspect. If you remember, even Lenin became aware of it. He wrote a letter, I don't remember to whom, but I know it was a letter to the comrades, Bolshevik comrades, about the Iranian constitutional revolution, in which he refers to this, the fact that, the British have such an influence on the Iranian clergy, and it goes back to this history of the Indian colonization. I was wondering if you could shed some more light on this. I gave a very crude, very sort of brief summary of the problem, but I hope you could shed more light on it.
Go ahead, Mike. The way we do this is people make comments and you reply immediately.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm not going to say an awful lot about this because I'm not enormously up in depth on it. I examined a guy's thesis, a bloke called Muhammad Zubair Abbasi, wrote about Sharia under the English legal system in India, on the basis of the treatment by the English Privy Council, which was the final court of appeal from the various Indian jurisdictions, of issues of Sharia, in particular in relation to Waqf and disputes about Waqf. My impression from Abbasi's work and the stuff which he cited was that the moment at which the British started creating British, quote, Mussulman law, which was what it was called by the British, was in the 1790s, after the British acquisition of Bengal, and then the Third Anglo-Mysore War, which is the point at which the British actually overthrow the Muslim regime in Mysore in southern India. It's the Deobandi school, isn't it, which develops in the 19th century madrasas, and is the foundation of the Islamic ideology of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, which is a great exporter of this sort. I'm going to be a bit cautious about, it's clearly the case that the British government, British colonialism, plays with religious fundamentalism of one sort and another as a tool against these endless divide and rule stories. And the British promoted radical Catholic fundamentalism as a tool against the Napoleonic regime, anti-liberalism as a tool against the Napoleonic regime in Spain in the Peninsular War. A little side story, which is of relatively marginal importance. The Iranian government, after the British military mission of 1810 to 1814, the Iranian government sent a bunch of Iranian students to study British technology in England. And they came and, among other things, visited the University of Oxford. Their diaries have been published, and they say, well, there's nothing for us at the University of Oxford. It's just a madrasa. It was just a Christian theological college. But I think there's it's not just a question of the manipulation by imperialism, though that's undoubtedly a very important part of it, but that capitalism as such produces what a Catholic author has called nomolatry, the worship of law, as idolatry is the worship of idols, the worship of thinking of laws, the religion as law religion. And Calvinism very much has that character. John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion is a legal text, and the Anglican Church is an entirely legal entity, and this Deobandi ideology, but also actually the Wahhabi ideology in Saudi Arabia is a legalistic form of Islam, is a particularly legalistic form of Islam, which tries to exclude Sufism and the personal sanctity of sheikhs and ceremonies and pilgrimages and all of that sort of stuff, and just make Islam into a body of rules. And there's a interesting book whose name I now can't remember, and I don't have it to hand because of it was in my office at work, and about the history of Shia law particularly, and the author of this argues that there's a profound mutation of Shia law resulting from the emigration of a significant bunch of Shia clergy to Saudi Arabia in the period under the Shah as a result of the conflicts between the Pahlavi regime and the Shia clergy, as a result of which Khomeini and his generation are trained in Wahhabi, Hanbali jurisprudence, and their Shia jurisprudence is different from, this author argues, prior Shia 12 Shia jurisprudence, but is because it's infected with the Hanbali Wahhabi legalism. And I suspect that this is not just a question of, as I said, of imperialist manipulation, but also of it's the nature of capitalism that it produces a legalistic version of religion to go along with its legalistic version of politics. That's it.
Thanks very much. I have a question in text, which I'm going to read because I'm not sure if you can see the text. So Nilofar has asked, thank you so much for the insightful, informative presentation. Can you recommend any scholarly resources of yourself that thoroughly covers British imperialism in history, particularly in relation to Iran or the Middle East? This would be very helpful for me to further study and understand the topic.
Well, as far as my own work is concerned, I can only point to articles in the Weekly Worker. There's nothing which is sort of enormously in depth. I have used, for the purposes of presentation, of preparing discussions, this book, Peter Good, The East India Company in Persia, which is on the 1600s and 1700s. Guillemette Crozet, I don't know if that's the right way of pronunciation, Inventing the Middle East, Britain and the Persian Gulf in the Age of Global Imperialism, is mainly about the 19th century. Running parallel and looking more at the Middle East more generally, Jonathan Parry, Promised Lands, the British and the Ottoman Middle East. He does actually, though, although he's trying to say he's only talking about the Ottoman Empire, he can't avoid also discussing British operations in the Persian Gulf and British policy in relation to Iran. This is very much focused on British policy. The author is a conservative, but he's the sort of conservative who is cynical about state interests and about and therefore is not engaged in, as an awful lot of liberal authors are engaged in, trying to prettify British policy.
Yes, on Iran, with some reservations, you might like to look at Stephanie Koenig, The Making of Modern Iran, under Reza Shah, only because I think she explains the coup and the various ways in which the British manipulated the system to bring Reza Shah to power, and how, in fact, how unpopular he was, even with the army as they did this. But it is limited to Iran. And yeah, so you have to see it in that light. Can I see other questions, comments? I'm going to, sorry. I'm going to make one additional comment on the whole history of Britain and Iran. I mean, Torab mentioned the story about the mullahs, the clerics, being, and the arguments in Iran that if you lift their turban underneath, it says made in England, which is well known to most Iranians. It's not known outside Iran. But the other one is a book, a whole set of stories that Jack Straw has actually written a book about, called The British Job. And it refers to what in Farsi we call Kare Ingilisi Ha. And this is part of, I think there was a TV series. I missed it because I think at the time I was in Britain. But there was a whole series about early 20th century Iran, during which an old man tells his relatives that anything that happens in Iran has to do with the British. So even if the weather is cold or the weather is hot or there's food or there isn't food, or even if his wife cooks a bad food, he blames the British for it. So Jack Straw has written this book which explains this, if you like, the fact that Iranians have this phobia about Britain, about England, in this way. And of course, some of it is exaggerated, some of it is not true, but that perception remains very much part of a generation, and that generation includes the current clerics in Iran, who, some of whom are of an older generation and haven't really, I don't think, have still not believed or still can't understand or don't read enough to understand the role of the US as the hegemonic power as opposed to Britain. There is an illusion amongst some of these people that even now it is Britain who, if you like, pulls the string of the United States as opposed to what we know, which is the UK government following everything that the US said. I wondered if this is true of other countries that were dominated by Britain, for example, India, Pakistan, or is this a speciality of Iran? Because in Iran, we can't get away from it. My own mother, until she died, was Syrian, and she wasn't uneducated, and she followed politics, not my politics, the opposite of my politics, but she followed it. rigorously. She believed, she was very much under the impression that we were just being fooled by the media, that the US wasn't really the dominant hegemon power. And I wondered if this is this is mirrored in other countries where the British imperialism had such strong presence, or is it peculiar to Iran? In what I believe Churchill said, a special category. Iran was put in a special category, which weren't really colonies, but were very much dominated. Thanks.
Yes, Lenin called them semi-colonies in Imperialism, the highest stage. It's a sort of helpful expression. It became in the 1960s called neocolonialism, but of course the reality was that this, quote, neocolonialism was also British policy towards client states in India and in the Gulf in the 1600s, 1700s, and Dutch policy towards Sweden, Poland, etc., in the Russia in the 17th century. So that the neo-colonial concept is unhelpful. Semi-colonial more or less works. I would guess, and it's no more than guess, I would guess that Iran would have particular issues because if there's anywhere which is working backwards, in the first part of my talk, I worked backwards through the history of Anglo-Iranian relations. And if ever there was a country which experienced only perfidious Albion, the inability of the UK to adopt a consistent policy or to hold up to its diplomatic commitments, it was Iran, because okay, India was colonized, fully colonized, but it wasn't the case that the Brits would constantly pick them up and dump them, pick them up and dump them, pick them up and dump them. Latin American countries might well have had that experience. Actually, almost certainly did have that experience as well. But of course, Latin American countries, the idea with Britain sold its interests in Latin America to the United States in exchange for arms in 1914-18. And so the Latin American countries have had ever since 1918 to get used to the idea that it's actually the US that runs the show rather than Britain. Whereas 1953 was still half Britain and half the US, and it's not wholly the process by which the United States has displaced Britain. The US didn't wholly take over in the Middle East because Britain and France were allowed to have an Arabist policy and to take a degree of distance from the United States' deep commitment to Israel until essentially the Gulf War of 2003, which in my opinion was primarily directed against German and French interests, German and French trade interests in the region. And at this point, the strings were drawn in, everything was reined in, and the ability of the British and French to pursue a semi-independent policy in the Middle East was taken away. And but the US, it is really quite a gradual process in the sense that Suez, okay, took away the ability of in 1956, took away the ability of the Brits to pursue an independent military policy in the Middle East, but they were still allowed to run relations with the Gulf states and not just the Aden colony, but also the Yemeni regime, which the British ran a clandestine civil war using mercenaries who were ex-special forces, quote, ex, unquote, special forces, through the early 1960s. So it's not, that's my point is then it's not mad to have thought that the British are still pulling the strings after the United States has taken over as the world hegemon power, because the United States had a veto power, which it expressed most visibly at Suez, forced the British and French out of Suez, but nonetheless, quite a lot of autonomy was left, and it's gradually been chipped away and removed as a result of events which have happened since. Does that address the issue, Yasmin?
Yes, thanks very much. That's very useful. Siamak, it's your turn, and then I'll ask Torab. There'll be two more at least. So, Siamak.
Okay. But I think Comrade Torab was before me. Is that on purpose? He raised
Yes,
his hand
because
before me.
he's already spoken, so you go first.
Oh, okay. So, okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Comrade Mike. It was really, really interesting and useful. My question is, I wanted to see if you can talk about or actually shed some lights specifically for the period of Reza Shah, the coming of to power of Reza Shah and his coronations, and the relation among the clergy and the British or British Imperialism at that time. Because I think, as you may know or not, there's been a lot of glorification of this period. Especially, we saw that during this latest Jinnah's uprising in Iran, with a lot of slogans such as, well, I don't know exactly the translation, but "Rest in peace, the great man Reza Khan," and so on and so forth. But it seems to be like there's this idea that this Reza Khan was, against the clergy, was trying on a constant basis to cut the influence of the clergy from the Iran, the difficulties they had. But what we know from the other research and the data that is available, that's not the real case. So I was wondering that if you can also shed some light on this period. I mean, if you have some information, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay, Yasmin has put in the chat Stephanie Cronin's book, The Making of Modern Iran, State and Society under Reza Shah, 1921 to 1941. And that's going to be a lot more high-powered historical work than anything I have to say. I would say I think it's pretty clear that the British put in Reza Khan, and the British General Ironside, who was had been responsible, as I said in the initial talk, Ironsides had been responsible for the intervention force against the Bolsheviks in Arkhangelsk in 1918-19, and then he'd been sent to carry on operations against Ataturk in support of the Greek invasion of Turkey in 1920, and it was from there that he was sent to Iran, and he promoted Reza Khan as being a good Cossack, good, reliable, manly, upstanding Cossack who was a suitable person to be promoted as a military dictator. And this is the culture in this is the same culture that the British had, not so much Ironsides himself, but the British in the Russian Civil War were constantly trying to promote the next strongman. Denikin, Kolchak, etc., wrangle, etc., etc. And always it was, this is the guy, this is the man who will be the strong man in our interest. So it looks as though Reza Khan is promoted in that sort of way. Second side of it, however, is going on at the same time. I said Ansides wasn't there when the coup actually took place because he something went to it happened. He had to be shipped off to hospital in Egypt. Either it was illness or an accident or something of that sort. But that 1921, in essence, Ataturk defeats the Entente invasion. And Ataturk in Turkey then embarks on a policy of Bonapartist modernization, which involves radical suppression of the clergy, so that he actually prohibits turbans, he prohibits beards, or at least he prohibits turbans and beards in universities, public offices, etc., etc., etc. And he gets a bunch of Turkish academics to translate the French Civil Code and just adopts it by fiat as Swiss Civil Code, just adopts by fiat this Turkish translation of the Swiss Civil Code. And similarly, he introduces radical modernization of the Turkish language. Yasemin was trying to do looking up Alexander Parvas's arguments in 1914 for why the Turks should join the Ottoman side. And it turned out this stuff was written in Osmanli Turkish, and finding somebody who could translate Osmanli Turkish into English at the present day was, can't do it. So this sense of Ataturk is going places. Ataturk is doing radical modernization in the same way in which the guys who did the Meiji Restoration, it appeared to be the case, the way in which the guys who did the Meiji Restoration in Japan were able to do a very radical modernization and industrialize very rapidly. Didn't quite work out like that for Ataturk because the guys who did the Meiji Restoration seized all the gold and silver assets of the Buddhist monasteries and stuff like that. And so they had a large capital fund to play with. But also the British gave the Japanese very considerable assistance with industrialization and military development, because the Japanese were to be the British spearhead in the Far East against Russia, and indeed did that job in 1904. Ataturk wasn't going to get that sort of stuff because he wasn't important enough as a southern bulwark against Russia. But nonetheless, it seems to me fairly clear that we can see in Reza Khan's much more tentative steps towards modernization, declericalization, and so on and so forth, some sense that the Ataturk regime in Turkey shows what's possible. And that winds up with, of course, that he becomes pro-German or wants to go for a pro-German neutrality, as the Swedes had gone for pro-German neutrality in the 1940s. And the British and the Soviets just invade Iran and dispose of him. As I say, I'm much less, the Cronin book is it's going to be far more useful than anything I say.
Thanks. Actually, that's a fairly reasonable summary of what it's very difficult. There aren't many historical recollections of the time. There are some in Persian, and I think she has used some of them, but that's a very reasonable summary. Tora,
Yes, but just one interesting point on this attempt of the British at creating a body of Islamic law in India. An interesting point is, of course, there's no such a thing as fundamental text of Islam. I mean, other than Quran, all the rest is, this in dispute. So what they did, based on these Mughal books, apparently, British legal scholar, if I remember his name, William Jones, somebody called William Jones. What he did was actually picked from these Mughal textbooks those bits of Sharia law which also coincided with British law. So what is funny is that, in fact, the fundamentalist Sharia Islamic law is partly British law, based on British law, is selections of, various religious texts, which are also in correspondence with the British law. But I wanted to make another point about East India Company that you mentioned. As you know, during the Safavid period, one of the major sources of income of the Safavid Empire was the trade in raw silk. Suddenly, the silk industry in Europe during the 17th, 16th, 17th, 18th century had expanded enormously, and there was a huge demand for raw silk. And one of the main exporters of raw silk in those days was Iran. Safavid Iran was one of the major exporters of raw silk. It is said Iran at the time, this is before the sea routes, took the British all the way to, China and India. Iran produced something like 2,000 tons of, silk raw, and almost 2/3 of it, is said, was exported. And it was exported against silver and gold. In those days, either through Russia or through the Gulf, these export routes were quite lucrative for Iranian Safavid Empire. In fact, a lot of the things that remain from Safavid period, all these fantastic buildings, squares, mosques, all these things that the Safavid have built, a lot of it is based on the income from this silk trade, which, as I said, was traded against gold and silver. Therefore, it was very lucrative for Iran. What East India Company does is quite funny. It takes over this trade, more or less. First of all, it takes Indian raw silk, and by exporting Indian raw silk, gradually reduces the reliance of Europe on Persian raw silk. Secondly, it takes over the trade between India and Iran, in the sense that after Russia, India was probably the second largest trading partner with Iran in those days. Iran imported a lot of stuff from India, cotton, spices, a lot of things. So what East India Company used to do, took over the trade of the Iranian raw silk, and in return gave it the import that Iran had to take from India. So it was basically without paying any money. So it dried up all the sources of, silver and gold for the Iranian state, which is said to be one of the major causes of the collapse of the Safavid Empire, actually. So it's interesting in a way to see how, these trading, very innocent, simple trading, arrangements caused havoc in those days in certain countries and destroyed empires and built new empires, etc. I know the whole history of the East India Company is another story all to itself, and it needs, many more, hours of discussion and introduction to understand it fully. But I just thought just to add this example to what you said. It wasn't a question, but if you want to add to it, I would be very happy to this.
Go ahead. Yeah.
That's extremely interesting. I must admit, I wasn't. I mean, as I say, I wasn't aware of that on because, as I say, the good book covers essentially the early 18th century, and so what precisely was going on in the 17th, I didn't pick up on. On the point about William Jones and Muslim law, he did the same thing with turning Hindu books into law books. I would be a little bit cautious about how far he was actually making it compliant with English law, because he was basically a Romanist. So certainly what he did with his Hindu stuff was to take the Indian law and sort of more or less forcibly shift it into the framework of the Institutes or elementary textbook of the Roman Emperor Justinian, which was something which a lot of people had been doing in Europe. So a guy called John Cowell wrote an English law within the framework of the Institutes in 1605. There's a book called The Law of the Swedes and Goths in the 1670s. There's various French books which increased the Romanization of French law. So it probably didn't look that weird, but at the same time, it clearly has the effect that people who have indeterminate and semi-political superiorities, little kinglets and tribal leaders, get turned into absolute owners of land. And by being turned into absolute owners of land, they're more or less social subordinates, get turned into serfs, unfree tenants. And there's been a series of studies of that. And Marx already commented on it in the 1850s, but there's been a series of studies about how land reform and the introduction of land registration in particular creates that effect. The EIC interposing itself, I think the EIC, East India Company, and also actually the Dutch East India Company, the French East India Company, the Portuguese, there's an enormously large overlap between trade and piracy in what they do in the Indian Ocean. That quite a lot of what they're doing is just driving rivals out by forcible piracy and taking of shipping and taking over the shipping. Because the fact that they're able to do that is presumably a consequence of why in the introduction I talked about the new shipping technology of the late 14th, 15th century, and also about the introduction of gunpowder and so on. So it's those technical capabilities which allow these guys at the end of extraordinarily long supply lines to impose themselves on the Gulf and the Indian Ocean and so on. That's it.
Okay, Faromaz, I've given you need to unmute yourself, and you can open your camera. You don't have to. It's up to you.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. It was a great talk. My question is sort of related. I hope that Comrade Mike would respond to it. It's regarding the resistance to basically imperialism and the political establishment which is serving the imperialism. at the time of Shah, let's say between 1951 and 3, Dr. Mossadegh was a sort of independent nationalist representing the middle class and all that. And he tried to nationalize the oil company. The Shah was backed by US and British imperialism. And finally, they did overthrow him. But the question is, sort of using Comrade Mike's reference to the policy of patience for the left socialist groups, that if we don't have the majority of working class to be aware and that we need to have some sort of socialist revolution, at that time, the left needs to be patient and stay in the opposition, but do take part in policies and actions which is beneficial to the working class and majority of the masses. At that time, was it a good policy, let's say for at that time was Tudeh Party of Iran, which was a official communist, and I know that you guys do not approve of, but in general, for progressives and left to support policies of, at least part of it, of Dr. Mossadegh against imperialist actions, was that, and then I'm relating it to beginning of the 1957 revolution. And we know that the clerical regime suppressed every kind of opposition, and at that time was the policy of patience, did the policy of patience really give us this idea or this option that we need to basically support people's freedom and democracy against the clerical regime, but at the same time, maybe even unite with some other non-leftist groups? Was it an option? I'm sorry, my question was not as related to your great talk, but thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I start with the proposition that I recommend in the book Revolutionary Strategy. I recommend the strategy of patience for the present day, on the basis that where we are is like the situation of the later 19th century workers' movement before the point at which it became mass. That is to say, when the Lassalleans and the Eisenachers unified in 1875, those were two groups of 9,000 and 11,000, which I admit is considerably bigger than quite a lot of left groups at the present date, but is nonetheless, how much of that was a real membership and how much of it was a paper membership, I don't know. The same is true of the Austrian Social Democratic groups before they unified, of the French Social Democratic groups before they unified, of the Italian Social Democratic groups before they unified. In Britain, the Social Democratic groups didn't unify, but remained as the SPD on the one hand, the SDF, Social Democratic Federation, the Delayonist Socialist Labour Party, the Independent Labour Party was Christian Socialist rather than the Social Democratic group. So my point then is that it's not, I don't think one can directly apply this set of reasoning to the conditions which existed in the 1950s and 1960s, because the conditions which existed in the 1950s and 1960s were ones where we had the Second World War, the social overturns in Eastern Europe and North Korea and North Vietnam, and the Chinese and Vietnamese revolutions, and the movement of US imperialism to promoting corporatist forms, in particular in the frontline states in Western Europe, or for that matter in Korea. The United States engaged in full-scale expropriation of the landlord class and the imposition by military force of land reform and distribution of land to the peasants at the expense of the existing landlord class and of the Buddhist and Confucian religious houses. So this is, and Tudeh was, as far as I understand it, close to being a mass organization, or certainly it was a very big organization. So I am not going to say, I think that there's a straightforward strategy of patience question posed by this, because it seems to me that the question of questions was the Soviet question, and the question of how you orient towards. I think the Trotskyists had an illusion of believing that it would be possible to have a revolution independent of the Soviet regime, which would then give rise to a Trotskyist alternative. And of course, I think it's actually also true of the Maoists that they, but at the same time, it was also the case, the problem was that the Soviet regime was utterly untrustworthy, because it just, I said, the British maneuvered for geopolitical advantage and dumped political clients at every moment in time. The Soviets did the same bloody thing. And really late, in fact, we can see this in Somalia, where the Soviets dumped the Somali regime, which had been a loyal client for 20 years, in the hope of winning the Derg, when the overthrow of Haile Selassie and this, and the upshot of that is the utter disaster in Somalia. So, as I say, I'm being a bit cautious about, can I give you an answer on this question? Because it's not, it's clear to me that as of 1948 to approximately 1975, the possibility existed of the extension of the so-called socialist camp by semi-autonomous processes, and that happened in Yugoslavia against the will of Moscow. It happened in Cuba because the particular conjuncture of the Sino-Soviet split and the battle with the anti-party group led Khrushchev to posture left, and the way of posturing left was to support the Castro administration and the Popular Socialist Party in Cuba in Sovietizing the Cuban economy. So you can't exclude then the possibility that it would have been possible to jump into the Soviet camp, but at the same time, actually, because the Soviet regime was extremely cautious and very, in a sense, rightly unwilling to get into a shooting war with the United States, because they didn't have. It wasn't until 1968 that the Soviets actually acquired the ability to hit the American mainland with nuclear weapons. so then the question, okay, so what do you do in this situation? I must admit, I don't have a, I mean, back in the 80s, I thought that I had an answer to that question, which was to pursue a quite united front policy towards the Soviet regime and fight for them to pursue a much more aggressive policy. But I'm sort of, as to what was actually possible, I don't know. The problem with alliance with the nationalists is, of course, they betray you. If you enter into a strategic alliance with the nationalists, they betray you. It's also the case if you enter into a strategic alliance with the liberals, they betray you. So you have to have your own strategic project, but within the framework of your own strategic project, there's no particular problem, in my opinion, in entering into tactical alliances, both with the liberals and, for that matter, with the other side. So, for example, the 10-Hour Day Act, which Marx celebrated as the foundational political economy of the working class, that the working class says, collectively, we will not work for more than 10 hours a day. That was passed with Tory votes against the liberals. So nothing to stop you maneuvering in the short term. What you have to not do is imagine that you give political confidence to either nationalists like Mossadegh or liberals of one sort and another. I hope that's some use. It's not. Perhaps cagier than I would be about present circumstances.
Thanks very much. Before I read Nilofar's question, we do, I think everyone here, after lots of quotes have been made about your book, Revolutionary Strategy, want you to come and talk about that. And Faramar has alluded to sections of the book. Clearly, he knows more than some comrades. I know a bit more. Anyway, that's for later. I have a further question, and I can't see any hands. So hopefully this is, you can summarize after this if you have anything else to say. So Nilofar is saying, I'm actually thinking of a study on commonalities among all liberation movements in the Middle East with a focus on Iran and Palestine. When comparing the effects of British imperialism on Iran and Palestine, what similarities do you identify, just 1 second, as the most significant? Go ahead.
Okay, I actually don't think there is much which is very significant, because Palestine is a case where the British sponsor a European settler colonial project of a sort which is, as Moshe Makover has put it, following Kautsky, a work colony, where the idea is that the settlers will actually displace the local inhabitants as opposed to employing the local inhabitants, and that's utterly different. It's not a totally unusual thing, because of course the colonies in North America and Australia were work colonies in that sense, and were settler colonies which were work colonies in that sense, and the result is a large-scale genocidal policy, ethnic cleansing on the largest possible scale, the restriction of the surviving local inhabitants to what was called in the United States Indian reservations, which is what the meaning of the so-called two-state solution in practice is. The creation of Indian reservations, but with actually less powers than the Navajo Nation or the Apache Nation have in the USA. So that's very dissimilar to Iran, where the policy has been absolutely one of semi-colonial creating puppet regimes with military interventions only when the military interventions are necessary to keep the puppet regimes under control, or because of larger geopolitical issues. If there is a commonality, the only commonality is the fundamental dishonesty of the British government, which was displayed in, I referred to in my talk, the persistent dishonesty of British colonial policy from 1800 through to the present day, but also, or through to the time of the Mossadegh regime and or for that matter, the takeover of responsibility by the United States afterwards. But equally, the British policy in Palestine was also characterized by dishonesty, because the British first promised the Arabs their own state in order to get them to rise up against the Ottoman Empire, and then betrayed them by making a behind-the-backs deal with the French for partitioning former Ottoman Syria and Iraq between the British and the French, which is then given the excuse of providing a national home for the Christians in Lebanon and a national home for the Jews in Palestine. But then, of course, in the 1930s, the British go on to betray the Jews as well. So they betray the Zionists as well. So that this endemic perfidious Albion, that I think is the only thing which is a real commonality between the cases of Palestine and of Iran. That's it.
Thanks very much. I would just add, Niloufar, that maybe the only way you can look at this is to look at the history of the Iranian opposition against the Shah's regime and their alliances with the Palestinian movement, and compare it with the disasters that we now see, where most young Iranians actually support Israel, or quite a sizable number of Iranians do support Israel. And maybe that will give you a comparative study. I mean, you could look at the Iranians who fought with the Palestinians, the Iranian left who fought and actually were participants in the Palestinian struggle, both from PKK, Fedayeen, the Palestine group, and so on. But I could send you some links later, but yeah.
Yes, and in that sense, actually, that's a commonality of the People's Front conception, the idea of unity with the national bourgeoisie in Palestine being Fatah, and oh God, what Fatah has done.
Very true, very true. But the limits of some of these people, that was their limits, given the they were fighting. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much. I can't see any hands. That was a very useful meeting. We will put it on YouTube, and I'll send the link to comrades who want it. Thank you very much, Mike. I will.
Thanks very much for inviting me, and I hope it's useful to comrades.
We hope to see you to speak about revolutionary strategy, but we'll give you some time. Don't worry. We will. Yes. Bye, everyone.